Hello dear friends, welcome to Histopast Forward. First, I have a small request for you. If there's anything you'd like me to improve in the story I tell in this video, please write to me in the comments. That way, by taking your suggestions into consideration in the next video, we can make this journey through history even more wonderful together. Today I will tell you the story titled, Why Mesopotamian Kings Slept with a Goddess Once a Year. This is a story, both religious and political, that delves behind the scenes of one of Mesopotamia's most mysterious and captivating rituals. I have one more request for you. Please write the date and time of your current location in the comments. That way we can all see together at what moments our friends from all corners of the world are listening to this story and feel this great journey through time together. Now, dim the lights slightly, pull your blanket over you, close your eyes, and let's begin our story. In the early city-states of Mesopotamia, there was a ritual performed at a specific time of year, known to all and silently revered. This was the ceremony of a symbolic marriage between the king and the goddess, known today as the sacred marriage, or, in Sumerian, Hieros Gamos. If you had lived in that era, you would have noticed the very atmosphere of the city change as the time for this ceremony approached. Daily tasks would continue in the streets, but conversations, trade, even the haggling in the marketplace would take on a lower tone. For the approaching day was not merely a religious day, but one that concerned the future of the city. The origins of this ritual were directly linked to Mesopotamia's agricultural, societal structure. The ceremony was nourished by the belief that the union between the goddess Inanna, Ishtar in Akkadian, and the king was essential for the fertility of the land, the proliferation of animals, and the welfare of the people. Inanna was not only the goddess of love and war. She was also the sacred power holding agricultural productivity and the city's destiny in her hands. The king was seen as her earthly consort, and through this ceremony it was believed he conveyed the goddess's power of fertility to the lands. The root of this belief stretches back to periods before the invention of writing. In early Sumerian temple ruins unearthed by archaeologists, reliefs have been found depicting a ceremonial couple side by side, along with goddess figures. While these reliefs symbolize the king's union with the goddess, the agricultural and harvest scenes depicted in the lower sections indicate that the ritual was directly associated with production and abundance. If you were to see such a relief carved in stone, you would sense, even from the posture of the figures, that this event carried a sacred meaning far different from an ordinary marriage. The sacred marriage ritual also served as a political tool. The king's status as the chosen consort of the goddess granted him not only earthly, but also divine legitimacy. This legitimacy made the king's decisions unquestionable in the eyes of the populace, strengthening his position even in treaties with neighboring cities. Particularly in early Sumerian city-states when agricultural yields declined or political crises arose, the king's successful performance of this ceremony was seen as an element that revitalized public morale. The timing of the ceremony was aligned with the agricultural calendar. It was usually performed before planting or harvest, during the period when the earth was awakening or resting. This timing was considered the period when the goddess's fertility power was most potent. Priests would observe the sky for months in advance, studying the flooding patterns of the rivers to determine this date, the position of the moon, the direction of the wind, the water levels along the riverbanks. All of these were signs that determined which day the ceremony would take place. One of the oldest written evidences regarding the origin of the ceremony is found on a cuneiform tablet from the city of Uruk. This tablet describes the king entering the goddess's temple, being welcomed by the high priestess as the goddess's earthly representative, and then the ceremonial union taking place. The text promises that following this union, the land would become fertile, animals would multiply, and the prosperity of the people would increase. As you read such a text on a clay tablet, you would feel that the rhythmic and repetitive structure of the words used was also part of the ceremonial hymns. It should not be forgotten that this ritual was not just a private moment between the king and the priestess, but a major public event in which the entire city participated. The people would gather in the temple square just before the ceremony, joining in the prayers led by the priests. These prayers were not only to honor the goddess, but also to invoke blessings upon the people's own lives. Incense would be burned in the square, offerings of grain and dates made, and in some places symbolic purification rituals were performed with a mixture of water and oil. However, the question of how this ancient ritual precisely emerged has not been fully answered. Some historians believe it evolved from seasonal mating rituals practiced by ancient pastoral communities to increase fertility. Others argue that it was a ceremony created entirely for political purposes. Archaeological findings offer clues to both views, but provide no definitive answer. And at this point, you might ask yourself, thousands of years ago, did the people walking the stone streets of Mesopotamia truly believe in the goddess's power of fertility in this ceremony, or was it merely a cleverly staged scene designed to consolidate the power of kings? As the day of the ceremony approached, preparations in the city would begin days in advance. If you were in one of the early Mesopotamian cities like Uruk, Ur, or Nippur in those days, you could see the signs even in the morning market. Beside the usually noisy stalls, this time incense sticks, bright fabrics, and special foods to be offered to the temples would be sold. Clusters of dates were carefully selected, the whitest barley grains separated, and jars full of pure oil were sealed. For these products were not for an ordinary meal, but for the sacred tables where the goddess and the king would partake. At the heart of the ritual were two figures, the king and the high priestess, representing the goddess. The high priestess was often the highest religious authority in the city, and her selection was not an easy process. This posit, iron meant not only taking the goddess's place in the ceremony, but also carrying her divine power for a year, serving her and acting as an intermediary between the people and the goddess. For this reason, the high priestess was usually chosen from noble families and received her education in the temple from an early age. Writing, music, hymns, astrology, knowledge of plants, all were part of her training. The king, on the other hand, participated in the ceremony not only as a political leader, but also in his capacity as the earthly consort of the goddess. On the morning of the ritual day, the king would begin his preparations in his own palace. First, a purification ceremony would be performed. Scented herbs and oils were added to pure water, placed in a large stone basin. The king would wash with this water, then dry himself with linen towels. This washing was seen not only as physical cleanliness, but also as spiritual purification. After purification, the king would put on the special garments he would wear for the ceremony. These clothes often consisted of a linen tunic embroidered with gold, colorful wool sashes, and head adornments resembling a crown. Symbols representing agricultural fertility were embroidered on his robe: palm branches, barley ears, and water waves. On his feet, he would wear finely embroidered sandals made of soft leather. This appearance of the king was a visual expression of his status, not merely as a ruler, but as the goddess's chosen consort. The high priestess's preparations were likewise meticulous. In the days preceding the ceremony, she would retreat into seclusion in the most sacred chamber of the temple, accompanied only by her closest priestesses. Her body would be massaged with sweet-smelling oils and her hair adorned with thin gold threads. distinct attention. The priestess walked beneath a canopy made of gold and white fabrics, accompanied by her priestesses. For the people, this meant witnessing the goddess's manifestation on earth. Upon arrival at the temple square, the first part of the ceremony would begin. The king and the priestess stood before the altar stone in the center of the square. Priests would place barley grains, baskets of dates, and jars of pure oil on the altar, and hymns would be sung. In these hymns the goddess was praised, and blessings of fertility for the land, multiplication for animals, and health for the people were requested. If you had been there, you would have noticed how the repetitive verses of the hymns, after a while, created a hypnotic rhythm. Then the king and the priestess would proceed into the inner part of the temple, to the sacred chamber accessible only to priests and chosen individuals. This room was where the most secret part of the ceremony would take place. A bed would be found in the chamber, surrounded by fine curtains. The bed was covered with soft wool, and palm branches and flowers were scattered upon it. This preparation was a reminder that the union was not merely physical, but a symbolic union of nature and fertility. The people would not directly witness this moment. They would remain in the square outside the temple, listening to the hymns coming from within. During the union, priests would recite prayers, consisting of words that reinforced the meaning of the ceremony. What occurred inside were the symbolic rituals representing the sacred union of the goddess and the king through the king and priestess. This ritual was not described in detail in ancient texts, perhaps because this part was considered a sacred secret known only to the gods and those who directly served them. When the union was completed, the king and the priestess would reappear before the people. This time, they would be wearing simpler garments, as the ceremonial attire was left inside. Their faces bore a serene expression, characteristic of those emerging from the ceremony. The priests would declare that the union had taken place, and the people would applaud with enthusiasm. This moment was seen as the moment when the goddess's power of fertility descended upon the earth. The final part of the ceremony was completed with a feast shared with the people. Barley bread, date syrup, and cooked meats prepared in the temple kitchens were distributed. Musicians continued to play, and people ate and sang throughout the day. This feast transformed the ritual from an individual experience into a communal celebration. But despite all this splendor, the same question would remain in everyone's mind. Did this ceremony truly bring the goddess's blessing, or was it merely a stage to consolidate the power of kings? After the sacred marriage ritual was completed, a quiet sense of relief would spread through the city for several days. The morning after the feast, the scent of incense would still linger in the streets, and the flower petals and palm branches used during the ceremony would be scattered by the wind in the squares. People would return to their work, go to their fields, and begin working in pottery workshops, but there would be a trace of the ceremony in every movement. If you had walked through the city in those days, you would have noticed vendors greeting customers in a softer tone as they opened their shops, and even the children's games carrying the rhythm of the hymns sung during the ceremony. The place of this ritual in communal memory was not limited to the hope for that year's bounty. Many families would recount significant ceremonies that had taken place during their generations. Stories like, "When I was a child, our king married Inanna, and the next year the date palms bent under the weight of their fruit," were passed down from generation to generation. These narratives, over time, blurred the line between actual event and legend. Every city incorporated minor variations into its own sacred marriage ritual. For instance, in Uruk, the goddess Inanna was central, and the ceremony mostly revolved around themes of love and fertility. In Nippur, due to the strong cult of Enlil, the role of the goddess carried a slightly different meaning, and the ceremony focused more on emphasizing political legitimacy. In some cities, the priestess varied according to the political standing of the participant. Sometimes the queen assumed this role, and sometimes a high priestess from the religious hierarchy was appointed. This diversity demonstrated that the ritual possessed not only religious, but also political and cultural flexibility. Kings would reinterpret this ceremony according to the needs of their reign. During periods of strength, splendid festivals would be held, while in times of crisis, simpler versions, imbued with more intense symbolic meanings, would be enacted. Archaeological findings indicate that this ceremony continued to evolve in form over centuries. While early Sumerian reliefs depict the king and the female figure representing the goddess side by side, some later Akkadian and Babylonian stone carvings portray this scene in a more abstract and symbolic manner. This change might be an indication that the ritual gradually became less physical and more representative. Written sources, especially cuneiform tablets, record that this ceremony was performed on a specific day of the year, after which the agricultural season began. Some texts state that on the day after the ceremony, farmers would go to their fields and sow the first seeds. This practice was based on the belief that the goddess's power of fertility needed to be immediately transferred to the earth. When you consider this, you realize that the ritual functioned, in a sense, as the beginning of the agricultural calendar. However, over time, this ceremony began to lose its former importance in some cities. There were several reasons for this. Firstly, as political balances in Mesopotamia shifted, kings no longer consolidated their legitimacy solely through religious rituals, but also through military victories and diplomatic agreements. Secondly, with changes in religious beliefs, the central position of the goddess was transferred to other deities in some regions. This led to the sacred marriage ceremony either transforming into other forms or disappearing entirely. Nevertheless, the ritual's place in memory was not easily erased. Even in literary texts written hundreds of years after the ceremony, the union between the king and the goddess was invoked as a symbol of fertility and order. Especially in love poems, the relationship between Inanna and the king was depicted as both divine and human love. Modern archaeology and historical research have made great efforts to understand the nature of this ceremony. Temple plans unearthed during excavations have helped us understand the layout and function of the rooms used in the ceremony. Furthermore, the texts of the hymns recited during the ceremony have survived to the present day on cuneiform tablets. The rhythmic and repetitive structure of these texts demonstrates how hypnotic and profound the ceremonial atmosphere could have been. Today, when looking at this ritual, it is insufficient to view it merely as a religious practice. The sacred marriage was a bridge connecting the agricultural, political, religious, and artistic spheres of Mesopotamian society. Through it, both the fertility of the land and the stability of governance were sought to be secured. But still, the question remains, did the people truly believe that the goddess's power of fertility was transferred to the earth through the king, or was this ceremony part of a political theatre that had continued for centuries? Perhaps the answer should be sought neither entirely in belief nor entirely in politics. For thousands of years ago, for the people living in the shadow of Mesopotamia's ziggurats, the line between the sacred and the political was not as sharp as we might think today. And perhaps this is why this ceremony could exist simultaneously as both an expression of faith and a demonstration of power. When the time for the sacred marriage ritual arrived, Mesopotamian cities would take on a different rhythm. If you had lived in a great city like Uruk or Nippur in those days, you would have felt the change in the air from the very first light of dawn. On normal days, the streets would awaken to the sounds of market stalls. But during this period, they would be more orderly and calm. People would speak of the ceremony in their conversations, inquire about the stage of preparations, and wonder about the activity around the temple. At the center of everything, the ziggurat rose. This massive, stepped temple not only symbolized the bond between gods and humans, but was also the place where the city's most important ceremonies took place. As the ziggurat's shadow fell upon the streets according to the sun's position, it was as if even that shadow was a herald of the approaching ritual. The preparation process began days, even weeks, in advance. First, the ziggurat and its surrounding temple complex were cleaned. This cleaning represented not only physical, but also symbolic purification. Priests would place palm branches in the corners of sacred areas and then anoint doorposts with oil. The ziggurat stairs were wiped with bronze-plated brushes, and the dust on the steps was carefully cleaned. The temple courtyard was arranged to accommodate thousands of people on the day of the ritual. Large stone basins were placed at the edge of the courtyard, and incense was put into them. When lit during the ceremony, this incense would emit sweet and pungent fragrances, enveloping the air in a sacred atmosphere. It was believed that the scent of incense pleased the goddess. One of the most striking parts of the ceremony preparation was the readying of the sacred chamber at the very top of the ziggurat. This room was considered the earthly dwelling of the goddess. The walls of the chamber were adorned with colorful clay frescoes. These frescoes featured symbols of the goddess, stars, the moon, and agricultural fertility motifs. The priestesses would clean this room in silence, murmuring soft hymns occasionally. The bed area was covered with soft wool, and fresh palm branches were spread upon it. The preparations reserved for the king were made with similar care. In the palace workshops, special robes he would wear on the day of the ceremony were woven and adorned with gold and lapis lazuli stones. The king's headdress was usually polished to reflect sunlight, symbolizing his representation of divine light. In the palace kitchen, special foods were prepared for the feast after the ceremony. Barley porridge, sweetened with honey, date syrup, freshly baked bread, and game meats. As the day of the ritual approached, people from all corners of the city would begin to arrive around the temple. Some came to participate in the ceremony, while others came merely to hear the hymns and leave offerings to the goddess. Would stay in a special room within the inner part of the temple. Only a few assistant priestesses would be present in this room. During her seclusion, the priestess would eat only pure foods, purify her body with sacred oils, and repeat divine readings. This process meant she was preparing herself spiritually and physically to represent the goddess. The king's preparation process, however, was divided between the palace and the temple. Before the day of the ceremony, the king would not appear in public. During this time, he would hold meetings with his advisors, political decisions would be postponed, and the focus would be solely on the ritual. The king's retreat into silence during this period was interpreted by the people as him purifying himself of earthly burdens for the encounter with the goddess. And amidst all these preparations, the same expectation would be in the minds of the people. Will this year's ceremony be fruitful? Will the seeds yield strong sprouts? Will the animals multiply? For the purpose of the ritual was not just a tradition, but a source of hope that would shape the living conditions of the coming year. But this hope always walked hand in hand with uncertainty. As you walked in the square in those days, you would have seen a bustling yet silent activity. For everyone knew that the goddess's favor was not guaranteed. When the day of the ceremony finally arrived, even the city's awakening would be different, as the first light washed over the highest steps of the ziggurat with a golden hue. An earlier activity than usual would begin in the streets. Guards who had kept watch throughout the night would silently take their steps to change positions at the temple gates, the changing of the guard being part of the pre-ceremonial discipline. The greater part of the populace would head towards the temple square with the first light of the sun. This square was large enough to accommodate the entire city for the ceremony. The main avenues leading to the square had been cleaned during the night before the ceremony, and palm branches and flowers had been placed along their edges. Incense smoke would rise from the windows of houses along the roads, a pungent yet pleasant scent mixing with the air. It was believed that this fragrance attracted the goddess's attention and would bless the city with bounty during the ceremony. In the king's palace, preparations began before dawn. Palace guards would check the paths the king would take, ensuring no obstacles remained. In the king's chamber, his closest attendants would work silently but carefully to prepare him for the ceremony. First, a purification ritual was performed. Pure river water was filled into a large flat stone basin, and sweet-scented herbs and flower petals were thrown into it. The king would wash with this water, then dry himself with fine linen towels. This purification symbolized not only physical cleansing, but also spiritual purity. After purification, the king would put on his ceremonial robes. The garment was made of white linen, embroidered with gold and lapis lazuli stones. These patterns featured fertility symbols such as water waves, barley ears, and palm branches. A wide embroidered sash was tied around his waist, and a golden crown was placed on his head. The front part of the crown usually bore a symbol of the goddess, sometimes a star, sometimes a crescent, and sometimes a lion motif. At the same hour in the temple, the high priestess's preparations would begin. She would emerge this morning from the room where she had been in seclusion for 7 days before the ceremony. Only her 2 closest priestesses would be with her. They would comb her hair, adorn it with thin gold threads, and place a small lapis lazuli stone on her forehead. The priestess's ceremonial attire consisted of a long, flowing white linen dress with goddess symbols embroidered in gold threads and a delicate shawl draped over her shoulders. Moon and star motifs were embroidered on the edges of her dress. As the morning progressed, the temple square grew crowded. People arrived early to secure the best spots. In the front rows were the city's dignitaries, representatives of artisan guilds, and priests not on duty in the temple. Behind them were farmers, merchants, children, and visitors from distant villages. Large incense burners were lit in the square, and the sweet and pungent mixture of smoke slowly rose into the air. The ceremonial procession would begin, moving from the king's palace towards the temple. Priests walked at the front. They carried symbols belonging to the goddess, a golden star, a sacred scepter, embroidered fabrics, lifting them slightly for the populace to see. Behind them were the musicians. Drums, lyres, and flutes played a slow, rhythmic melody. This music set the tempo for the steps, imparting a sense of ceremonial harmony to both those walking and those watching. The king walked in the middle of this procession. Beside him were his close guards and the highest officials of the state. As he walked, he nodded to greet the people, sometimes gesturing with his hand. His face bore a serious but gentle expression. This day was one that demonstrated both his power and his divine connection with the goddess. Following the king, the arrival of the high priestess was one of the most striking moments of the ceremony. She walked beneath a canopy made of gold and white fabrics, carried by 4 priestesses. When the people saw her, they fell silent. Some bowed their heads, for this moment was regarded as the moment when the goddess walked on earth. Upon arriving at the temple square, the king and the high priestess, Aski, ended the wide stone steps together, entering the large courtyard at the base of the ziggurat. In the center of the courtyard was a large stone altar where offerings would be placed. Priests placed barley grains, baskets of dates, jars of oil, and fresh flowers on this altar. As the offerings were placed, hymns began. These hymns were sung loudly but with a calm rhythm. In each verse, the name of the goddess was invoked, and blessings of abundance rain. Strong harvests were requested. If you had been there, you would have noticed that the repetitive structure of these hymns and the drum rhythm had a gradually trance-inducing effect. During the hymns, the king and high priestess stood on either side of the altar. The king held a golden cup in his hand, while the priestess carried a small jar of oil. At one point, the king placed the cup on the altar, and the priestess opened the jar, dripping a few drops of oil onto the altar. This act was seen as the symbolic beginning of the union and fertility. This point of the ceremony was a moment both visible and palpable for the people, for it was here that the first call to the goddess was made. The priests would then announce that the king and priestess would ascend to the sacred chamber at the top of the ziggurat. The people could not witness this part directly. However, the sounds of drums and flutes coming from above would announce that the ritual was continuing inside. Meanwhile, the people remained in the square. Some prayed in silence, others cast palm branches into the incense burners. Children held their parents' hands, their eyes fixed on the summit of the ziggurat. There, though unseen, it was believed that the goddess and the king were uniting. As the sun reached its zenith, the first part of this sacred encounter was complete. The king and priestess would emerge before the people again after a short while, their faces bearing the calm and serene expression of those who had emerged from the ceremony. This moment was when the hopes of the people were renewed and their expectations for the coming year's bounty were strengthened. But the meaning of the ceremony lay not only in what happened that day, but in how this moment was remembered throughout the city for an entire year. For this day was seen as the guarantee of the king's bond with the goddess, the prosperity of the people, and the order of agriculture. And if you were there, you would feel that this atmosphere carried both a sacred and a political power, that people were connected to this ceremony both by belief and as part of the established order. When the second part of the ceremony was completed, the rest of the day transformed into a state of anticipation. The people gathered in the lower courtyard of the ziggurat and in the surrounding squares knew that the king and the high priestess had ascended to the upper floors, to the sacred chamber. This was the beginning of the process leading directly to the union ceremony. However, that part was out of the public eye. It continued in sacred areas accessible only to priests and chosen assistants. The people remaining in the square slowly withdrew into groups, recounting what they had seen that day. Some drew conclusions from the king's facial expression, suggesting that the goddess's favor would be stronger this year. Others said that the priestess's dignified walk indicated the ceremony would be successful. These interpretations stemmed from the people's own observations and beliefs rather than definitive knowledge. For the temple officials, these hours were a time to plan for the next day's preparations. For after the union ceremony, a great celebration shared with the populace would take place the following day. Thus the temple kitchens would work through the night, preparing barley porridge, bread, date syrup, and cooked meats. Stages for the festivities would be set up in the temple courtyard, and musicians would hold their rehearsals. As the shadow of the ziggurat lengthened with the evening sun, a different kind of silence spread over the city. Although people seemed to have shaken off the day's tension, they would spend the night in anticipation of the ceremony's continuation. In some homes, families would pray together. Children would make wishes to the goddess for an abundant harvest in the coming year, and elders would recall old ceremonies and bountiful years. Inside the temple, the silence would be much more intense. The high priestess would continue her ceremonial preparations in the sacred chamber. These preparations were not only for the union to take place the next day, but also for the weight of the responsibility of representing the goddess. The priestesses beside her would place small oil lamps in the four corners of the room, ensuring the light from the lamps cast a soft glow into the chamber. The room was adorned with fresh palm branches and flowers, and fine linen covers were spread over the bed area. The king, on his part, would spend the night in a special chamber located on the lower floors of the ziggurat. This room was sparsely but symbolically furnished with rich objects, vessels bearing fertility symbols, barley ears, an embroidered scepter, and a small statue bearing the goddess's emblem. The king's solitude in this room was seen as both a ceremonial retreat and a mental preparation. As night deepened, the sounds in the city diminished and the streets emptied. Only the footsteps of the guards around the temple and faint music from afar could be heard. Some priests would continue chanting hymns in the temple courtyard throughout the night. This practice ensured that the goddess's attention remained focused on the city. For the people, this night was a waiting filled with both hope and uneasiness. For the success of the sacred marriage ceremony was believed to determine the bounty of the coming year. If famine or disease broke out the following year, this could sometimes be interpreted as the ceremony not having been performed well enough. For this reason, both the king and the priestess felt a great responsibility upon their shoulders. Towards dawn, those working in the temple kitchens would be about to complete their preparations. Breads baked in large stone ovens and barley porridges simmered in massive cauldrons. The sharing of these foods with the people the next day was one of the strongest symbols of the ritual's communal aspect. The goddess's bounty was reflected not only in the fields, but also at the tables. In the final hours of the night, the temple priests would inspect the sacred objects. Offering vessels were polished, and the fabrics to be used in the ceremony were adjusted. Jewels, gold embroideries, and symbolic scepters were arranged in a specific order, for everything needed to appear flawless the next day. And on the morning of the next day, the city would awaken once more in the shadow of the ziggurat. The people would gather in the square, discussing the procession and hymns they had witnessed the day before. The king and priestess would emerge together from the sacred chamber to complete the most important moment of the ceremony, and the goddess's power of fertility would be declared to have descended upon the city. But before that moment arrived, this night, the silent bridge between the 2 days of the ceremony would hold a deep place in the minds of the people, for this night was believed to be when the decision was made for how the coming year would unfold. And perhaps for this reason, everyone would ask themselves the same question as they looked at the top of the ziggurat. Will the goddess bless us with her favor this year, or will she test us? As the first rays of the sun gently began to illuminate the horizon of the Mesopotamian plain, a silent yet intense energy was felt over the city on the day of the ceremony. The steps of the ziggurat glistened with a golden shimmer, and this radiance spread into the temple courtyard, and from there into the narrow streets of the city. The preparations of the previous day and the hymn recitations that continued through the night had already shaped the atmosphere of today. Now the waiting was over, and all eyes were turned to a single moment, the meeting of the king and the high priestess, representing the goddess. The king's awakening was not like the start of an ordinary morning. That morning, the inner courtyard of the palace was silent. Only the soft chirping of birds and the gentle sound of water flowing through the channels could be heard. Guards stood on either side of the long corridor leading to the king's private chamber, their attire and posture conveying a ceremonial solemnity. Before the sun had fully risen, the king's closest attendants entered his room with silent steps. First, the ceremonial purification was prepared for the king. In the center of the palace's stone courtyard, a large basin with bronze engravings was placed. The basin was filled with pure river water. Into it, pleasant-smelling plants, fresh flower petals, and a few drops of precious oil had been added. When the king approached the basin with slow steps, the attendants silently withdrew. This purification was seen not only as physical cleansing but also as the renewal of spiritual purity. As he leaned over the water, he saw his own reflection. Today, that reflection represented not just a ruler but the chosen consort of the goddess. After the purification, the ceremonial garments were prepared. The tunic the king wore was woven from fine white linen, its edges embroidered with gold thread. On the front of the garment were motifs symbolizing fertility and power: date palms, barley ears, and water ripples. A wide sash adorned with lapis lazuli stones hung from his shoulders. The golden crown on his head was polished to reflect the sunlight. In the center of the crown was a symbol belonging to the goddess, the star motif, chosen for this year. As the king dressed, an elderly priest standing in the corner of the room began to recite ceremonial prayers. These prayers were to prepare the king's spirit for his ceremonial duty, to purify his thoughts from worldly matters. Each prayer was spoken in a deep and slow tone, the words echoing off the stone walls, creating a more impactful effect. In the outer courtyard of the palace, a ceremonial procession was being prepared, awaiting the king's exit. At the front were priests carrying symbols of the goddess, a golden star, an embroidered staff, sacred objects wrapped in white linen cloths. Behind them, the ceremonial musicians took their places. These musicians, playing lyres, drums, and flutes, would maintain a steady rhythm throughout the march, imparting a sense of ceremonial harmony to both those walking and those watching. When the king emerged from the palace gate, the sunlight had begun to fall upon the city. The people gathered on both sides of the palace gate bowed their heads in greeting. The king walked with slow steps, acknowledging them with a slight raising of his hand. Today was seen as the day he was not merely a ruler, but the chosen consort of the goddess. Along the main avenue leading to the temple, people lined both sides. Date palm branches and flowers were scattered along the roadside, and incense burners were placed at various points. The incense smoke hung in the air like a fine mist, and sunlight filtered through this smoke, casting a soft glow on the path. Children held their mothers' hands tightly, watching the king's passage with great curiosity. Elders closed their eyes and prayed, appealing to the goddess for this moment to bring fertility to the city. As they approached the temple square, the ziggurats' steps rose in all their majesty. Priests and priestesses stationed on the upper floors looked down, observing the king's arrival. The crowd gathered in the square slowly fell silent with the music accompanying the king's steps. This silence was an expression of both reverence and anticipation. At that very moment, in the inner courtyard of the temple, the high priestess waited, ready. She had emerged from her seclusion of the previous day, dressed in her ceremonial robes. She wore a white linen gown with a golden embroidered shawl draped over her shoulders. Moon and star motifs were embroidered along the edges of her dress. Her hair was braided with thin gold threads, and a small lapis lazuli stone was placed on her forehead. Beside her were two assistant priestesses who would accompany her in the ceremony. As the king entered the temple courtyard, the high priestess walked towards him. They met before the altar. The area around the altar was left wide open for the people to witness this moment. The king carried a golden cup in his hand. The priestess held a small sealed jar of oil. Accompanied by the loud hymns recited by the priests, they both approached the altar. The king placed the cup on the altar, and the priestess opened the jar, dripping a few drops of oil onto the altar. This act was the symbolic beginning of the union process. This moment, in the eyes of the people, was the acceptance of the goddess's presence on earth. The priests slowed the tempo of the hymns, creating a ceremonial atmosphere. The repetitive words of the hymns brought everyone there, and those waiting beyond the temple walls, into a deep state of peace. If you had been there, you would have felt that the combination of the deep sound of the drums and the light melodies of the lyres slowed the passage of time. When this encounter was completed, the king and the priestess began to ascend the ziggurat stairs. As they walked towards the sacred chamber on the upper floors, the crowd watched them in silence. For there, out of sight of the people, the holiest moment of the year would take place. But even for the people, this procession itself was a powerful enough symbol. The king and the priestess walking side by side with slow and harmonious steps was seen as a tangible expression of the bond between God and human. And everyone knew that the strength of this bond would determine the fertility of the coming year. In those moments, there was a single thought in the city. Will the goddess show her favor to the city this year as well? The ascent of the king and the high priestess up the ziggurat steps was like a slow ceremonial procession in the eyes of everyone in the square. The steps were wide but steep. With each stride, their gold-embroidered garments caught the sunlight, creating a brief shimmer. The people watched them silently, accompanied by the music that matched their steps. This silence was not just of reverence, but also of anticipation. As they neared the top of the ziggurat, a gentle breeze blew, making the edges of their white linen fabrics undulate. From above, the city's rooftops, streets, marketplaces, and distant fields were visible. This height, in the eyes of the king and the priestess, was not merely a panorama, but a symbolic view of all the people they represented. Upon reaching the uppermost floor, they were met by the chief priest, who awaited them at the entrance of the sacred chamber. The chief priest raised his hands and recited a brief prayer. This prayer was intended to purify the souls and bodies of those entering the goddess's presence. Afterward, the king and the priestess stepped inside. The sacred chamber was a spacious but simple area. The walls were covered with frescoes adorned with stars, the moon, and agricultural fertility symbols. In the center, there was a bed covered with fine linen sheets. This bed was decorated with date palm branches and fresh flowers. These plants were symbols of fertility and renewal. Small oil lamps burned in the four corners of the room, their light casting flickering shadows on the walls. The atmosphere inside was very different from outside. The scent of incense was strong but not overwhelming. A mixture of sandalwood and sweet resin fragrances created a calming effect. Priests stood silently at the side, holding ceremonial items in their hands. A gold-embroidered staff was handed to the king. This staff symbolized both the power of governance and his symbolic connection with the goddess. A silver bowl filled with pure oil was given to the priestess. This oil represented the fertility of the union. The ceremony began in silence. The chief priest slowly and rhythmically began to chant a hymn. This hymn described the king being accepted as the goddess's consort on earth, ensuring that her power of fertility would flow to the land and the people. The hymn consisted of repetitive verses. Each repetition deepened the meaning of the words, spreading a meditative atmosphere within. Meanwhile, the people waiting in the square outside heard the distant echo of the hymns. The sounds reverberated off the ziggurat's stone walls, descending and spreading in waves over the crowd. Some closed their eyes, listening to the hymns, while others raised their hands to the sky in prayer. Children, leaning on their mothers' laps, began to doze off during this long wait. As the ceremony progressed inside, the king and the priestess moved to either side of the altar. In the center of the altar was a large vessel filled with earth and water. The king dipped and withdrew his staff into the water. This symbolized the earth meeting water and the beginning of fertility. The priestess, in turn, dripped a few drops of oil from her hand into this water. This symbolized the goddess's favor mingling with the earth. Then the chief priest gave a ceremonial signal. The king and the priestess proceeded towards the bed area. This section was completely out of sight of the public and known as the area where only the most sacred symbols were located. The union that took place here carried both physical and symbolic meanings. Ancient texts rarely described this part explicitly. Often only indirect phrases like the sealing of fertility were used. Outside, meanwhile, the rhythm of the drums slowed. The sound of the flutes softened, and the tone of the lyres became lighter. This musical change announced to the public outside that the sacred moment inside had begun. The crowd in the square fell silent at this instant. In the sacred chamber, a brief silence followed the union. This silence was interpreted as the moment fertility passed from the goddess to the earth. Then the chief priest would begin to pray again, this time offering wishes for the coming year's rains, crops, proliferation of animals, and the health of the people. The king and the priestess would rest for a short while in the sacred chamber after emerging from the ceremonial part. This rest was important, not to prevent the ceremonial energy from dissipating and to regain inner peace. During this time, the lights of the lamps inside would dim slightly, and the smoke of the incense would slowly rise to the ceiling of the room. The people waiting in the square, at the end of this wait, most wanted to see one thing: the king and the priestess descending the ziggurat steps together. Because this descent symbolized the completion of the ceremony and the goddess's favor descending upon the city. But that moment had not yet come. The silence lingering at the top of the ziggurat stirred both curiosity and a peaceful sense of anticipation within the people. They wanted to believe that at the end of this wait, they would receive good news. And if you had been in that square, you would have felt hundreds of people holding their breath at the same time. The drums heard occasionally like a distant echo, the scent of incense slowly dissipating with the wind. This moment was the culmination of both sacred and human expectation. The silence in the sacred chamber had caused time to practically stand still for the thousands of people waiting in the square outside. Everyone knew that this moment was one of the holiest of the year. No drums were playing, no hymns were being sung. Only the scent of incense, carried by a gentle breeze, permeated people's faces and clothes, deepening the weight of this waiting. Then a slight stir was seen from the upper floors of the ziggurat. First, a few priests slowly began to descend the stairs. After them, the public's eyes caught sight of the two figures they had most awaited, the king and the high priestess, side by side, slowly descending the steps. This descent was not merely a physical act, but the moment the ceremony met the people. The king's face held a serene and focused expression. His gaze was directed forward, yet a softness was felt in him.
The steps.
The high priestess, her head slightly bowed, advanced with the priestesses walking on either side of her. The gold embroideries on their garments caught the sunlight, shimmering with each step. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, the crowd watched them in deep silence. Then the chief priest spoke the ceremonial words in a loud voice. "The goddess has blessed her people with bounty. This year our lands will be fertile, our animals healthy, and our children strong." These words had a profound effect on the people. Suddenly, hands rose to the sky in prayer, murmurs of devotion were heard, and some could not hold back their tears. For this moment embodied not just a religious ceremony, but the hopes of an entire year. The king and the priestess approached the altar. On the altar, first the king placed the golden cup he held. The cup still held the pure water within as a symbol of the sacred union. Then the priestess dripped a few drops of oil from a small jar onto the altar, completing the offering. This act symbolized the sealing of the goddess's fertility. After the offering, the priests moved aside, creating a wide opening for the public to see, and the celebration part of the ceremony began. From the corners of the square, musicians began to play drums, lyres, and flutes. This time, the rhythms were merrier. Melodies were played that the people could sing and dance to. Large baskets brought from the temple kitchens were placed at various points in the square. Inside the baskets were breads, date clusters, and cooked meats. Officials began distributing these foods to the public. This sharing symbolized that the goddess's bounty was equally distributed among everyone. The celebrations were not limited to food and music. Artisan guilds displayed the works they offered to the goddess in the ceremony, and merchants exhibited their most valuable goods in the square, showing that abundance had come to the city. Children used the small date palm branches distributed from the temple in their games, and young people danced at the edges of the square. But amidst all this joy, a ceremonial order was still felt. The king and the priestess greeted the people from the large stone platform in the center of the square, sharing short prayers with them. This moment was a tangible demonstration of the renewal of the bond between the divine and the people. As the day progressed, the celebrations spilled into the city streets. Small tables were set up in front of houses, and people offered food and drink to each other. Children played games, unaware that they would recount this day to their own children in the future. And elders reminisced about ceremonies from past years. And as night fell, lamps still burned atop the temple and the ziggurat. These lights symbolized that the goddess's favor had not left the city, and her protection continued throughout the night. When people saw these lights from afar, they felt safe. The next day, farmers heading to their fields would sow their first seeds, believing that this ceremony would bring fertility. Potters working in their workshops would believe their hands would be more bountiful, and merchants would think their trade would be more profitable. The effect of the ceremony spread not only to religious aspects, but to every area of daily life. And thus, the king's path would be completed. This path was not merely a physical route from the palace to the temple, it was also a path where the people's hopes, beliefs, and trust in the future were shaped. But still, the same silent question lingered in everyone's mind. Did the success of the ceremony truly depend on the goddess's fertility, or was it a ritual of reassurance created by people to strengthen their own beliefs? As the sunset slowly faded into night across the vast plains of Mesopotamia, preparations continued with utmost seriousness atop the ziggurat. After the day-long ceremonies, the city's noise had receded and festivities had begun in the squares. But on the uppermost floor of the ziggurat, completely out of sight of the crowd, a different kind of silence reigned. This was the time reserved for one of the year's most secret and sacred moments, the meeting of the king and the high priestess, representing the goddess. The true essence of this ritual, called the sacred marriage, took place here, witnessed by only a few. The scant, explicit descriptions of this section in ancient texts were a matter of both secrecy and reverence. If you had been there at that moment, you would have felt yourself in an atmosphere where even the slightest sound carried meaning. The doors of the sacred chamber had been sealed by the chief priest earlier in the day. Now, with the night, these seals were removed and the lamps inside were relit. On the walls were depictions of the goddess Inanna and symbols of fertility, stars, the moon, date palm branches, and barley ears stood side by side within the frescoes. These symbols reminded one at every glance of the ceremony's purpose, to ensure the fertility of the land the welfare of the people, and the continuity of divine order. In the center of the room, there was a wide bed. The bed was covered with soft wool, and fresh date palm branches and flowers were scattered upon it. The scent of sandalwood and sweet resin mingled with incense, filling the air of the room. This fragrance was used not only to create a pleasant atmosphere, but also to calm the mind and prepare the body for the ceremonial union. When the king stood at the entrance of the room, he wore a simpler version of the ceremonial garments he had worn during the day. Gold embroidery still gleamed on his shoulders, but this moment was one where meaning took precedence over ostentation. In his hand, he carried a small golden bowl to be offered to the goddess. The bowl contained pure water, symbolizing the essence of earth and life. The high priestess waited at the other end of the room. The dress she wore, in place of the magnificent ceremonial attire of the day, was a simple yet elegant gown woven from white linen and gold threads. In her hand she held a small jar filled with sweet-smelling oils. This oil would be used during the union and placed at the head of the bed as a symbol of the goddess's favor. The chief priest recited a brief prayer at the door of the chamber. This prayer asked for the king and the priestess to be in harmony with divine powers and to transfer the goddess's fertility to the land and the people. When the prayer concluded, the chief priest and his assistants silently exited the room. Now, only the king, the priestess, and the sacred symbols remained inside. At this point, the ritual steps would begin with symbolic gestures. First, the king would place the golden bowl he held on a small altar beside the bed. Then the priestess would drip a few drops of oil from the jar onto the altar. This act represented the sealing of the land's fertility through the union of water and oil. Afterward, the priestess would place her hand on the king's shoulder. This touch symbolized the bond between the goddess and the king. After these symbolic gestures, the hymns would begin. Unlike the hymns sung in the square during the day, these had a slower, deeper tone. Their words described the king being chosen as the goddess's consort, and this bond being sanctified for the welfare of the people and the land. The rhythm of the hymns was arranged to synchronize with their breathing, which brought both mind and body into ceremonial harmony. Outside, the people could not hear these hymns. They could only see the faint lights and incense smoke rising from the top of the ziggurat. In their eyes, this was a symbol of the goddess's descent to earth. Children, even as they fell asleep beside their families, would etch this image into their memories to tell their own children in the future. These moments spent in the sacred chamber felt as if they were outside of time. Every movement, every breath, every glance was part of a tradition millennia old. This section, referred to as the sealing of the night in ancient tablets, was the climax of the ceremony. With the symbolic completion of the union, the priestess would place the jar at the head of the bed, while the king would take the bowl from the altar and place it in the corner of the room. This was the final step taken to preserve the goddess's fertility and share it with the people the next day. And with this moment, the night would slowly deepen. As the lamps in the room dimmed and the smoke of the incense slowly rose to the ceiling, preparations for a new day would begin outside, because the next morning the bounty of this sacred night would be proclaimed to the entire city. But that night, at the top of the ziggurat, there were only 2 people and the presence of the goddess. And perhaps that is why this moment continued to be recounted as both truth and legend for centuries. In the deep hours of the night, the scent of incense still lingered in the sacred chamber atop the ziggurat. The light of the lamps cast flickering shadows upon the fertility symbols on the walls. Outside, the city was enveloped in silence, with only the footsteps of guards patrolling the temple courtyard and the distant sound of wind audible. This silence was woven into the fabric of the sacred union that had continued throughout the night. As the first rays of the sun began to appear on the eastern horizon, a slow but steady activity began in the sacred chamber. The high priestess, in her ceremonial white linen gown, sat on the edge of the bed, holding the small jar containing fertility oils. The king stood silently by the altar, his eyes focused on the patterns on the floor. This silence indicated not that the ceremony had ended, but that preparation for its final step was underway. When the chief priest entered the chamber, he carried a gold-embroidered covering. This covering had been prepared for the king and the priestess to wear when they appeared before the people after the sacred union. The chief priest first approached the priestess. He gently placed the golden shawl on her shoulders, then affixed the ceremonial crown to the king's head. This preparation meant making the divine bond visible before appearing before the public. The exit from the sacred chamber was carried out in a specific order. First, the chief priest and his assistants walked ahead, carrying the symbols of the goddess. Behind them, the king and the priestess walked side by side. As this procession passed through the narrow stone corridors of the ziggurat and reached the wide stairs descending from the uppermost platform, the sun had already fully risen. The people waiting in the square eagerly anticipated this moment. Although some had returned home overnight, most had remained around the temple, taking their places from the early hours of the morning. As the first rays of the sun struck the ziggurat steps, the silhouettes of two figures appeared at the top of the stairs. First, silence reigned, then a faint murmur rose from the crowd. The descent of the king and the priestess proceeded with a ceremonial rhythm. With each step, the golden threads of their garments caught the sunlight, and their gleam reflected on the faces of the crowd. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, the chief priest spoke the words of blessing aloud. "The goddess has bestowed her favor upon our people once again this year. Our land will be fertile, our animals healthy, and our children strong." These words had a profound effect on the people. All at once, hands were raised to the sky, prayers were murmured, and some could not hold back their tears. For this moment embodied not just a religious ceremony, but the materialization of a whole year's hopes. The king and the priestess approached the altar. First, the king placed the golden cup he held upon the altar. The cup still held the pure water within, as a symbol of the sacred union. Then the priestess dripped a few drops of oil from her jar onto the altar. This act signified the sealing of the goddess's fertility. After the offering, the priests moved aside, opening wide for the public to see, and the celebratory part of the ceremony began. From the corners of the square, musicians began to play drums, lyres, and flutes. This time, the rhythms were merrier. Melodies were played that the people could sing and dance to. Foods prepared overnight were brought out from the temple kitchens. Large baskets held fresh breads, date clusters, barley porridges, sweetened with honey, and cooked meats. Officials began distributing these to the public. This sharing symbolized the goddess's bounty was shared equally with everyone. The celebrations were not limited to food and music. Artisan guilds displayed their works offered to the goddess in the ceremony, and merchants exhibited their most valuable goods in the square, demonstrating the abundance that had come to the city. Children used the small date palm branches distributed from the temple in their games, and young people danced at the edges of the square. But amidst all this joy, a ceremonial order was still felt. The king and the priestess greeted the people from the large stone platform in the center of the square. hiring short prayers with them. This moment was a tangible demonstration of the renewal of the bond between the divine and the people. As the day progressed, the celebrations spread into the city streets. Small tables were set up in front of houses, and neighbors offered food to each other. Children played games, unaware that they would recount this day to their own children in the future, and elders reminisced about ceremonies from past years. And as night fell, lamps still burned atop the ziggurat. These lights symbolized that the goddess's favor had not left the city, ensuring protection and bounty over the people. Even those from distant villages would watch these lights for a while before setting off, wanting the moment to remain in their memories. In this way, the sacred night was completed, spreading throughout the city with the first light of morning. But the true impact of the ceremony would be felt in the following days and months, in the fields, in the markets, in the homes, because people would attribute that year's bounty to the blessing of this night and morning. When the day of celebration concluded, the city gradually began to return to silence. In the squares, after a day of music and laughter, the scent of incense still lingered in the air. On the ground were date palm branches, flower petals, and crumbs from the distributed bread. However, this disarray was not a sign of disorder, but the traces of unity that the city had celebrated together for a day. That night, weary from the ceremony, the people retreated to their homes. Inside, families sat around their tables, discussing the events of the day. Children recounted the king's and priestess's descent from the stairs in their own words, sometimes exaggerating details, sometimes embellishing with imagination. Elders made comparisons, recalling past ceremonies, commenting, "So, the priestess's walk was legitimacy, right calm this year," or "The king was as solemn as in his grandfather's time." The ceremony's effect on the people was not limited to that day. The next day, farmers going to their fields would feel a strong confidence within them that the year would be bountiful as they sowed their seeds. Potters would believe that the vessels they made would sell faster, and merchants would trust that their trade routes would encounter fewer obstacles. This belief was not only a source of religious hope, but also a social motivation. Politically, the ceremony reinforced the king's power and legitimacy. The people saw the king not merely as a ruler, but as the chosen consort of the goddess. This made it difficult to question the king's decisions, granting him divine authority. Envoys from neighboring cities would also observe these ceremonies, reporting what they had seen upon returning to their own cities. Thus, the ceremony became a display of power not only within the city, but throughout the region. Religiously, the sacred marriage ritual concretized the goddess's influence over the people. It was believed that this ceremony had to be performed flawlessly for the goddess Inanna's power of fertility to continue throughout the year. If famine, disease, or other disasters occurred during the year, some would attribute it to the ceremony not being performed correctly. Therefore, everyone involved in the ceremony, from the chief priest to the priestesses, felt the pressure to perform their duties perfectly. In the collective memory of the people, each year's ceremony held a distinct place. In some years, an extraordinary star seen in the sky during the ceremony or a sudden gust of wind would be interpreted as a sign of whether that year would be bountiful or barren. In other years, a special motif on the king's or priestess's garments would become legendary among the people. For example, the golden lion motif on the priestess's gown was considered a harbinger of a strong and protective year. Scribes would record important moments of the ceremony on clay tablets. These records included many details, from the hymns sung and offerings made during the ceremony to the weather conditions. In this way, centuries later, the traces of these ceremonies became information discoverable in archaeological excavations. Even on the day after the celebrations, the city's atmosphere still carried a ceremonial peace. When the markets opened, merchants would greet their customers by saying, "May the goddess's bounty be upon us." And artisans would add wishes of fertility to the products they made. Children would imitate ceremonial processions in their games, one acting as the king, the other as the priestess. This memory was preserved not only through oral tradition, but also through artistic expressions. Scenes from the ceremony were depicted on small clay seals, wall paintings, and metalwork. These depictions ensured that the ritual remained continuously alive in both religious and cultural memory. But there was another dimension to this memory. The ceremony created a sense of security for the people in the face of future uncertainties. The unpredictability of nature, wars, diseases. Against all these risks, the sacred marriage ceremony provided a psychological strength for people to endure another year. As years passed, some ceremonies were remembered more than others. Especially the ceremonies of bountiful years became legendary among the people. Narratives like, "That year the date palms bowed with fruit," or "That year the barley ears shone like gold," were passed down from generation to generation. This permanence of the ceremony in memory showed that it was a cornerstone of both religious and social structure. But amidst all these narratives, a silent question always persisted. Did this ceremony truly bring the goddess's fertility, or was it a tradition created by the people to keep their own faith alive? Perhaps the answer lay within faith itself. For the people living in Mesopotamia, the line between the sacred and the mundane was not as clear as we perceive it. And perhaps that is why a night spent atop the ziggurat and the morning that followed continued to be recounted for centuries as both truth and legend. A day had passed since the completion of the sacred marriage ceremony. The city's exuberance was felt in a calmer but deeper way than the noisy celebrations of the previous day. Traces of the festivities were still visible in the squares, on the streets, and on the people: date palm branches, flower petals, the scent of incense burned during the ceremony, and most importantly, an expression of confidence on the faces of the people. In Mesopotamia, the day after meant beginning to test the success of the ceremony. For the sacred marriage was not merely a symbolic union, but an event that directly marked the beginning of the agricultural season. After the ceremony, landowners, farmers, shepherds, and merchants would begin to look for signs of fertility. If you had lived in those days, you would have noticed increased activity on the roads leading out of the city in the early morning. As the sun rose, farmers would head to their fields with simple but effective farming tools. Some dragged wooden ploughs pulled by oxen, while others carried sacks of seeds on their shoulders. This scene was repeated in the same way every year, but this year was different. The first seeds, sown in the earth, were believed to have been blessed with the goddess's bounty a day earlier. Upon arriving at the fields, a short ceremony would first be performed. Farmers would scatter a handful of barley or wheat grains on the ground, then pour a few drops of water onto the soil. This water would either be brought from the river or would be sacred water obtained from the temple. Some farmers would bury a small piece of ceremonial bread distributed from the temple kitchens in the earth. This act symbolized the nourishment of the soil, both physically and spiritually. The scent of the earth held a completely different meaning during this period. The soil, softened after the rainy season and ready for planting, would emit faint vapors with the first rays of the sun. A farmer smelling this scent would dream of the fertile days ahead. When hands were plunged into the earth, it became not just a task, but a ritual. For every movement reinforced the belief that the goddess's fertility had passed into the soil. For the shepherds, the day after held a different importance as well. They would take their flocks to the pastures in the early morning. The behavior of the sheep, goats and cattle would be carefully observed. If the animals grazed calmly and with appetite, it was interpreted as a sign that the year would be productive. Some elderly shepherds believed that even the sparkle in the animals' eyes was an indication of the goddess's favor. The marketplaces also came alive again on the day after the ceremony. Merchants would open their stalls, arranging products symbolizing the bounty of the new season in the front rows. Sacks of barley, baskets of fresh dates, newly made pottery, all carried a silent message that the coming year would be both rich and stable. Trade in the market during this period took place in a more amicable atmosphere than usual, for everyone was part of the same belief and the same hope. Temple officials, on the other hand, would recite the closing prayers of the ceremony the next day. These prayers consisted of thanksgiving to the goddess and wishes for fertility to last throughout the year. People gathered in the temple courtyard would silently join in these prayers. This moment was the official completion of the ceremony, but also a declaration that its effects would continue in daily life. Archaeological records indicate that farmers performed planting activities with specific rituals during this period. Some cuneiform tablets contain detailed notes regarding the first day of planting. These records specify which fields would be sown first, which seeds would be brought from which region, and which offerings would be made before planting. This system created a framework that protected both agricultural productivity and religious order. The people would be careful observers of nature as they sought the first signs of fertility. In the spring months, the number of flowers blooming along the riverbanks, the speed at which trees leafed out, the color of the sky, all were interpreted as signs. If swallows arrived earlier than usual, it was believed that the rains would fall on time that year. If river floods were balanced, the fields would receive neither too little nor too much water, which would herald a good harvest. Elderly scholars in the city also examined the sky and the positions of the stars in the days that followed. For them, fertility depended not only on the earth and water, but also on the approval of the heavens. Specific stellar alignments were used to make predictions about how the year would unfold. These predictions could sometimes even alter farmers' planting plans. Deferred tasks would also be rapidly completed after the ceremony. Artisans believed they would finish the work they couldn't during the winter more quickly in the new season. Potters during this period produced special vessels bearing fertility symbols, preparing them for both the market and offerings to the temple. Weavers would create fabrics with the colors of the goddess, which were typically used in both daily wear and on special occasions. This day following the ceremony meant not only the recommencement of economic activities for the people, but also a period when social bonds were strengthened. Neighbors would help each other, share seeds, and collectively utilize labor, especially those with small fields could plant with the help of larger landowners. This solidarity was the most tangible demonstration of the ceremony's social impact. And amidst all this activity, the memory of the ceremony was still alive. Even while working, people would mentally visualize the king and priestess descending the ziggurat steps a day earlier. This image was not only a religious memory, but also a source of social motivation. But perhaps the most important aspect of the day after was also the quietest: hope. As farmers sowed their seeds, as shepherds herded their flocks, as merchants arranged their stalls, the same silent phrase echoed within everyone: "This year will be bountiful." And this belief, perhaps, was as powerful an influence as fertility itself. The search for fertility, which began on the day after the ceremony, was not confined to a single day. In fact, it was a process that unfolded slowly over weeks. Because understanding the fertility of the soil was not possible overnight or in just a few days, people had to patiently observe nature, interpreting every small sign. In the first week, there would be no visible change on the soil's surface after the seeds were sown. Yet this very waiting created a vivid curiosity in the public's mind. Farmers would go to their fields every morning before sunrise, walk slowly over the areas they had sown, and check the soil's moisture. They would grasp the soil with their hands, trying to discern if the lower layers were moist. If the soil was still soft and damp, it was an indication that the necessary conditions for the seeds to sprout were met. During this period, the amount of rainfall was one of the most important factors. Too much rain could cause the seeds to rot. Insufficient rain could lead to them drying out. Therefore, people constantly watched the sky. The color of the clouds seen on the eastern horizon in the mornings, the direction of the wind blowing in the evenings, and even the brightness of the moon seen in the night sky were all interpreted as harbingers of rain. By the second week, the patient waiting would begin to give way to the first exciting news. In some areas of the fields, thin green lines would appear on the soil's surface. These were signs that the seeds beneath the soil had begun to sprout. Farmers who saw the first sprouts would immediately inform their neighbors, and this joyful development would spread rapidly. However, not every sprout was a source of joy. Farmers would carefully examine how densely and evenly the sprouts emerged. Sprouts that were evenly spaced and appeared healthy were a sign of balanced fertility. Sparse or weak sprouts, on the other hand, indicated a problem in the soil. In such cases, some areas would be replanted. During these weeks, shepherds also made observations in their areas. If the flocks grazed longer in areas where fresh grass had grown, it was an indication that the pastures were in good condition. Shepherds also measured the milk yield of sheep and goats. An increase in milk quantity was a sign not only that the animals were well fed, but also that the entire ecosystem was in harmony. The marketplaces also continued to be bustling during this period. As news of sprouting came in, merchants' trade plans would also change. If it was believed that the year would be fruitful, merchants would prepare to buy and sell more products. This preparation sometimes included renewing trade agreements with other cities. By the third week, the sprouts would be gin to show their small leaves. For the people, this was not just an agricultural development, but also a tangible proof of the promise of fertility given by the goddess in the ceremony. Farmers walking in their fields would observe the morning dew on the sprouts. Abundant dew indicated good nocturnal moisture, which meant the plants would develop healthily. During this period, temple priests also made observations. They examined not only agricultural areas, but also the flow of rivers, the migration of birds, and the positions of stars in the sky, because it was believed that fertility was connected not only to the earth, but also to the heavens. Priests would record these observations on their tablets, preserving them for comparison in later years. These observations also played an important role in the daily lives of the people. In the evenings, families sitting in front of their homes would share the signs they had seen that day with each other. Sentences like, "The wind blew from the north today, it will rain this week," or "The sprouts look lusher than last year," were not just conversations, but also a collective sharing of knowledge. By the fourth week, the fields would begin to be covered with a green blanket. This sight would lift the morale of the city's inhabitants. Children would play in the margins of the fields, while elders would watch this scene, recalling the fertile seasons of past years. Young farmers, on the other hand, believed that this bounty was a combination of their hard work and the goddess's favor. But during this process, not only nature was observed, social solidarity also strengthened. If a farmer had a problem in his field, his neighbors would help him, providing missing seeds or labor. These aids were not just given without expectation of return, they also implied a silent agreement that the same support would be returned in future years. Throughout these weeks, the memories of the ceremony also remained fresh. Even while working, people would recall the image of the king and the priestess descending from the top of the ziggurat, believing that this image invoked fertility. This memory was not only a religious belief but also a source of social motivation. As months progressed, these first sprouts would turn into strong stalks and leaves. Each stage of growth was seen as proof that the goddess's fertility continued. Farmers would regularly measure the development in their fields, tracking the ripening process of the crop. These measurements were part of both agricultural knowledge and religious rituals. And throughout this entire process, the same question always echoed in the minds of the people. Will this year truly be bountiful? Because even if all observations were promising, nature's final decision had not yet been made. This uncertainty led to a continued wait that generated both excitement and apprehension. Months passed, and the first sprouts that had emerged from the seeds were now beginning to ripen. Even under Mesopotamia's scorching summer sun, the fields were covered in various shades of green. Tall barley stalks swayed in the wind, sometimes creating the image of a silent sea. For the farmers, this sight was the most concrete evidence of the sacred marriage ceremony, because the growth and ripening of the seeds sown after the ceremony were accepted as a clear indication of the goddess's favor. This period before the harvest was a time of both excitement and preparation. Everyone in the city awaited the ripening of the fields while simultaneously preparing for a great labor. Farmers would begin to sharpen their sickles, checking the condition of sacks, baskets, and grain stores. Shepherds planned to keep their flocks in areas near the fields during harvest time, providing easily accessible food sources for the laborers. Temple officials were also not idle during this period, for harvest was not only an economic activity, but also a religious event. On the first day of harvest, the first sheaves would be gathered from the fields to be offered to the goddess. These sheaves would be placed on the altar in a special ceremony held in the temple courtyard, and priests would offer prayers for the continuation of fertility. This practice held both religious and symbolic significance to ensure that the source of fertility was not forgotten. In the weeks before the harvest, natural signs became even more important in the eyes of the people. If night winds blew gently and the morning dew was abundant, it meant the crops would be robust. If birds in the fields were particularly interested in barley ears, it was an indication that the grains were tasty and nutritious. Elderly farmers carefully followed such signs, teaching the young what each observation meant. During this process, the memory of the sacred marriage ceremony was still alive. People, while working in the fields or chatting in the city square, would recall what happened at that ceremony. Comments like, "How long the priestess's hymns were that year. It means the goddess will give her bounty in abundance," would be made. In this way, a continuous link was established between the religious ritual and agricultural outcomes. Harvest preparations were made not only in the fields, but also in the city. Granaries where grains would be stored were cleaned, their walls plastered with new mud, and doors reinforced to prevent rodents from entering. In the market, lists of goods to be exchanged after the harvest were made, and merchants planned the routes of caravans that would go to neighboring cities. When harvest day arrived, it was not merely an economic beginning, but also a sign of a day of celebration. At dawn, farmers would go to the fields, and the first strokes of the sickle were performed with a ceremonial movement. These first sheaves were immediately taken to the temple, and with the prayer of the priests, fertility was officially declared. Then the communal harvest would begin. The communal harvest was a period when social bonds strengthened. Families, neighbors, and relatives worked together, helping each other in the fields throughout the day. Songs were sung during the harvest, sometimes repeating the melodies of the hymns played on the day of the ceremony. This both lightened the work and brought the spirit of the sacred marriage ceremony to the harvest fields. In years when the harvest was bountiful, the atmosphere in the city would be completely different. Marketplaces would overflow with sacks of grain, and bakeries would fill the city with the aroma of fresh bread. This abundance was directly associated with the success of the ceremony. People would bring additional offerings to the temple to express gratitude to the goddess: fresh fruits, milk, honey, and processed grain products. However, not every year was equally productive. In some years, climatic conditions or diseases affected the crops. Even in such cases, the people would not question the importance of the ceremony. On the contrary, they would say, "This year the goddess tested us," believing that the next year's ceremony needed to be performed with more care and attention. The harvest season was also a time for planning for the future. A portion of the harvested grains was set aside as seeds, and the remainder was planned for consumption, trade, and storage. During this planning process, the principle of sharing the bounty, taught by the ceremony, was applied. Grains were distributed to the poor, and offerings were left at the temple. All of this process was etched into the public memory, directly linked to the sacred marriage ceremony. For the ceremony was not just a beginning, but at the center of a year-long cycle. Every step of the harvest period was strengthened by the meaning it carried in the memory of that ceremonial night and the day that followed. And so when the greatest labor of the year, the harvest, was completed, the people, as they prepared for the new year's cycle of fertility, would always return to the same thought. This bounty came thanks to the power of the bond between the goddess and the king. The sacred marriage ceremony in Mesopotamian city-states was not merely a religious ritual, but also a powerful political tool. If you had lived in that era, you would have noticed that the hymns sung and the symbolic gestures made during the ceremony were cleverly devised not only to invoke fertility, but also to consolidate the king's authority. For this ritual was the most visible stage of the kingship's administrative structure, the strongest proof of the king's divine legitimacy. Held annually on a specific date, the sacred marriage not only marked the beginning of the agricultural season, but also renewed the king's bond with the goddess in the eyes of the people. This bond was based on the belief that the power to govern came directly from the will of the gods. For the people, this ceremony was a clear declaration that the king was not only a political leader, but also the earthly representative of divine order. The political aspect of the ceremony was felt from the preparation stage onwards. The city's dignitaries, artisan guilds, merchants, and envoys from neighboring cities would invariably be present at the ceremony. This, in a sense, served as a diplomatic gathering. Especially for the representatives of neighboring cities, the ceremony was an opportunity to observe the king's power, the people's loyalty, and the order within the city. Within this crowd, the king did not merely assume a religious role, he also projected the image of a powerful ruler. The king's demeanor and actions during the ceremony left deep impressions in the minds of the people and foreign observers. His silent but confident steps, his measured gestures when greeting the public, his harmony with the chief priest and the high priestess, all of these conveyed the message that the king was a harmonious ruler in the eyes of both gods and humans. This harmony was seen as an element of trust in both internal politics and foreign relations. Another political function of the ceremony was to reiterate social order. Throughout all stages of the ritual, the city's hierarchy was clearly presented. Priests represented religious authority, the king political authority, and the high priestess the earthly mediation of divine fertility. The people would witness this hierarchy reaffirmed each year in the ceremony, thus reinforcing social roles. The sacred marriage became even more important in times of crisis to strengthen the king's position. For example, during periods of drought, famine, or political turmoil, the performance of the ceremony with great splendor raised public morale and conveyed the message that the king still enjoyed the support of the gods. This message played a vital role, especially in times when public trust was shaken. From a diplomatic perspective, the ceremony was an opportunity to strengthen relations with neighboring cities. Invited foreign envoys would be impressed by the ceremony's grandeur and the people's loyalty to their king, compelling them to acknowledge his religious and political authority upon returning to their own countries. In some cases, trade agreements were concluded and alliances renewed after these ceremonies. Therefore, the sacred marriage was not merely a religious ritual, but also a diplomatic spectacle. Another political dimension of the ceremony was its impact on the distribution of resources. The grain, oil, fabrics, and precious metals used for ceremony preparations showcased the city's production capacity and wealth. This was a display of power for both the public and foreign guests. The distribution of food during the ceremony symbolized the king's generosity and his commitment to his people. Thus, the king reinforced both his divine and earthly authority. The sacred marriage ceremony also held an important place in the city's long-term political memory. How the ceremony proceeded, how magnificent it was, and which symbols were emphasized would be discussed for years. A successful ceremony was remembered as initiating periods of stability and fertility under the king's rule. Weak or troubled ceremonies, on the other hand, left a negative impression in the public's mind, sometimes leading to whispers questioning the king's power. And perhaps most importantly, this ceremony was used as a political tool to shape the future of the kingdom. The king used the ceremony not only to gain the god's favor, but also to win the hearts of his people, to intimidate his enemies, and to reassure his allies. Thus, the sacred marriage became an indispensable part of both religious and political life in Mesopotamia. With the end of the sacred marriage ceremony, city life seemed to return to its usual flow. However, this return was only on the surface, for the political effects of the ceremony were deeply felt for days and weeks. Many important decisions made in the kingdom's administration were announced within the atmosphere of divine legitimacy created by this ritual. One of the first moves made immediately after the ceremony would be the king's meeting with the public and dignitaries. These meetings were often arranged while the ceremony's influence was still strongly felt. In these gatherings, the king would articulate both plans concerning the agricultural season and decisions on political matters. The people would view these decisions not merely within a worldly logical framework, but as steps taken with the goddess's approval. Thus, the king would solidify his policies on a religious foundation. For example, major infrastructure projects such as the construction of a new irrigation canal or the maintenance of existing canals would be announced after the ceremony. Such projects were considered necessary for the continuation of fertility and contributed to the perception of the king as a leader who fulfilled the goddess's will. If a project was initiated after the ceremony, it meant it was a sacred duty. The legitimacy created by the ceremony was not limited to internal politics. In foreign relations, this ritual was also an important tool. Envoys from neighboring cities would recount the splendor of the ceremony and the people's loyalty to their king upon their return. These narratives reinforced the image of the king as not only a powerful leader, but also one chosen by the gods. This image provided a significant advantage in diplomatic negotiations. The idea that a king had the direct support of the gods could mean that challenging him was not to be risked. Intercity trade agreements were also shaped under the shadow of this ritual. Foreign merchants attending the ceremony would witness the city's wealth and order, perceiving it as a reliable trading partner. This trust contributed to the strengthening of economic relations. For example, the abundance of food distributed to the public during the ceremony was seen as an indicator of the city's food production capacity. This, in turn placed the city in an advantageous position in commercial agreements. Another political function of the ceremony was to maintain social peace. The sacred marriage united different social strata of the populace around a common purpose. Farmers, artisans, merchants, and priests all played their roles in this ceremony, thereby strengthening social bonds. The king would use this sense of unity to his advantage, initiating social aid programs after the ceremony to increase public support. Steps such as distributing grain to the poor, alleviating debts, or temporarily lifting certain taxes reinforced both the king's generosity and the positive impact of the ceremony on the people. In times of crisis, this political dimension became even more pronounced. In situations like drought, famine, or political unrest, the ceremony gained extraordinary importance. During such periods, performing the ceremony with greater splendor and prominence was a critical strategy to boost public morale and demonstrate that the king still enjoyed the goddess's support. This strategy was effective in rebuilding the confidence of both the public and external observers. One of the long-term effects of the ceremony was the strengthening of the king's image. The people remembered him not only for his military achievements, but also for his symbolic marriage to the goddess. Bountiful years under a king's rule were recounted for generations as proof of his religious and political power. This ensured that the king's name was favorably recorded in historical records. The political power of the ceremony also manifested in its relationship with the chief priest and temple authority. The king's success in the ceremony strengthened the support of the priestly class, solidifying the alliance between the temple and the kingship. This alliance was vital for the political balance in the city. The temple was the greatest authority guiding the religious beliefs of the people, and the king's appearance in harmony with this authority ensured stability in governance. The atmosphere created by the ceremony also influenced the public's stance on political decisions. A decision that might normally be controversial would be more easily accepted immediately after the ceremony. This was because the people tended to view such decisions as steps approved by the goddess. The king's ability to utilize this timing effectively provided him with a significant political advantage. All this demonstrates that the sacred marriage ceremony in Mesopotamia was not merely a religious practice, but a multi-layered political strategy. The king expertly used this ritual to strengthen his position in the eyes of both his people and the outside world. The ceremony had become a tool that consolidated his power, legitimized his decisions, and gave him an advantage in intercity relations. And perhaps most importantly, the political impact created by this ceremony was based not just on a single day of the year, but on a perception that lasted throughout the entire year. As long as the people regarded the king as the goddess's chosen consort, they did not hesitate to obey his authority. This bond was so strong, both religiously and politically, that it held a central place in the governance tradition of Mesopotamian city-states for centuries. The political impact of the sacred marriage ceremony did not remain constant throughout the history of Mesopotamian city-states. In some periods, this ritual was the most important means of legitimacy that elevated kings' power to its peak. In others, it lost its former influence due to shifting political balances and religious beliefs, but in whatever form it took, the memory of the ritual continued to live on in the public consciousness. In the early Sumerian period, early 3rd millennium BCE, this ceremony was still entirely religiously centered. While the king was seen as the chosen consort of the goddess, governance was largely conducted in conjunction with priests and temple administration. During this period, the ceremony was performed more to ensure religious integrity than for political meaning. However, as cities grew and trade networks developed, kings discovered the political power of this ritual. The ceremony was no longer just a call for fertility, but also a diplomatic showcase demonstrating the city-state's power to its neighbors. During the Akkadian Empire, the 24th to 22nd centuries BCE, as imperial borders expanded, the ritual became even more central. Sargon and his successors reinforced their power by celebrating this ceremony not only in their own cities but also across imperial territories. In this period, the ceremony became an integral part of royal ideology. Through this symbolic marriage with the goddess, kings conveyed a message of divine right to both their own people and the conquered regions. However, this power could not remain consistently high, particularly in the 21st century BCE. During the III period, tensions occasionally arose between the central administration and temple authorities. Some chief priests argued that the true meaning of the ceremony was being overly exploited for political purposes. This led to the ceremony being performed in a simpler, even more symbolic manner in some years. In such periods, the king's political legitimacy relied less on the ceremony. Military victories and economic achievements took precedence. By the Babylonian period, 18th, 6th centuries BCE, the ceremony again became a powerful political tool. Kings like Hammurabi, in particular, associated their justice and legal regulations with the sacred marriage, thereby building both religious and legal legitimacy. The people believed their kings were both the goddess's consort and the protector of laws. This dual image enabled Babylonian kings to maintain their authority for a long time. However, over time, the diversification of religious beliefs and the rise of new cults of deities began to weaken the central position of this ritual. In the mid-1st millennium BCE, as political power balances shifted in Mesopotamia, some kings completely abandoned the ceremony or continued it only as a symbolic commemoration. Especially during the Assyrian period, displays of military strength became more important than the sacred marriage. Nevertheless, the ritual was not entirely forgotten. It continued at the popular level in some cities. The memory of the ritual lived on not only through official records, but also through the oral tradition of the people. Elders would tell the youth which king's reign brought bountiful years and how the ceremony was performed in those years. These narratives, though blurring the line between history and legend, ensured that the ritual retained its value in the public's eyes. Some kings made special efforts to restore the former splendor of the ceremony. For example, Nabonidus, in the late Babylonian period, revived the symbolic marriage with the goddess. However, while this created satisfaction among some of the people, it generated a feeling in others that the old order was being artificially resurrected. Still, these initiatives showed how powerful a symbol the ceremony was. The ritual's changing political role over time was in fact a reflection of the general transformations in Mesopotamian history. In periods of strong central authorities, the ritual was like a pillar supporting the continuation of power. In times of political instability, it was either reduced to a purely ceremonial formality or temporarily forgotten, but it never completely disappeared. The way this ritual was remembered by later generations had both a nostalgic and an instructive quality. People remembered great kings of the past along with the sacred marriage ceremonies they performed. Some legends recounted that the goddess granted special favors to certain kings while turning her back on others. These narratives served as both inspiration and warning for rulers. Gaining the goddess's love was the key to the kingship's longevity. Modern archaeology has found traces of this ritual in both written documents and works of art. Clay tablets contained records detailing how the ceremony was performed step by step. Wall reliefs in temples depicted scenes of the king and the priestess, representing the goddess standing side by side. These findings confirmed the important place the ritual held in both religious and political life. Ultimately, the sacred marriage ceremony in Mesopotamian history endured as not only a fertility ritual, but also an institution that legitimized the governing power of kings, strengthened intercity relations, and left deep marks on the public's memory. Although its form and impact changed over time, its legacy remained one of the most striking elements of Mesopotamia's political culture, and perhaps most notably, the power of this ritual rested not only on the goddess's favor, but on the people's belief. For as long as the people believed, the king's authority and the ritual's impact continued to exist. When faith weakened, the political meaning of the ritual slowly faded into the pages of history. One of the most striking elements of the sacred marriage ceremony in Mesopotamia was the identity of the woman representing the goddess. This woman was the figure who stood beside the king in the ceremony, embodying the symbolic presence of divine fertility. Her presence was of great importance not only for ceremonial aesthetics, but also for the religious and political balance of the city. Whoever she was, whether high priestess or queen, the person assuming this role became one of the most visible and influential women of the year. In early periods, particularly in the initial centuries of Sumerian city-states, the sole possessor of this role was the high priestess. The high priestess was raised under the supervision of the temple from childhood, memorizing sacred texts and learning every step of the divine rituals. Her education was not limited to religious knowledge. It encompassed a wide range, from astronomy to agricultural calendars, music to ceremonial dances. This was because the person representing the goddess needed to be not merely a figure but also a symbol of divine wisdom. These priestesses held a privileged position in society. They did not marry, yet their ties with their families were not entirely severed. They possessed an inviolable status in the eyes of both the public and the ruling class. The high priestess assuming this role kept the religious aspect of the ceremony strong and made the cooperation between the temple and the kingship visible. However, over time, as the political power of kings increased, a shift in this role came into question, especially during periods when the royal family sought to strengthen its own religious legitimacy. The role of the goddess began to be given to the queen. The queen was already the highest-ranking woman in the palace. As the king's consort, she was a powerful figure in the eyes of both the public and diplomatic circles. Her assuming the role of the goddess transformed the king's divine connection from merely a personal ritual to a message that the entire royal family was blessed. This change was not always welcomed by religious circles. Temple authorities argued that the role of the goddess should only be given to priestesses who had received religious training. According to them, this duty was not a matter of ordinary ceremonial beauty or royal prestige, but the responsibility of representing the goddess's will on earth flawlessly and correctly. The queen's lack of this training could lead to a decrease in ceremonial depth. Nevertheless, for kings, this change offered strategic advantages. Bringing the queen into the goddess's role gave the palace complete control over the ceremony. Thus, the temple's central role in the ceremony weakened, and the kingship became the primary center of religious power as well. This situation strengthened the king's hand, particularly during periods of political struggle. The selection of the woman to represent the goddess was one of the most talked about topics among the people throughout the year. Everyone wondered who this name would be months before the ceremony. If the high priestess was chosen, the people believed it would be more sacred religiously. If the queen was chosen, it was thought that the ceremony would be grander and more resources from the royal treasury would be allocated. The woman who would undertake this role would enter a special preparation period before the ceremony. Preparations usually began with a retreat lasting 7 days. During this time, the woman would stay in the sacred chamber of the temple or a private section of the palace. She would take daily purification baths, recite special prayers, and consume only specific foods. These foods typically included barley porridge, dates, fresh vegetables, and sacred water. The aim was to purify both body and mind for the ceremonial duty. The garments, in themselves, carried a ceremonial symbolism. The woman assuming the role of the goddess would wear a long dress made of white linen. The edges of this dress were embroidered with gold threads, and symbols of the goddess, a star, moon, date palm branch, or barley ear, were emblazoned upon it. A thin, gold shawl was draped over her shoulders, her hair was combed with special oils and adorned with braids. On her head there was usually a crown made of lapis lazuli stone. When the day of the ceremony arrived, this woman would become the earthly image of the goddess in the eyes of the people. Her every movement, every glance carried meaning. Her steps as she approached the altar, the way she raised her hand to make the oil offering, the expression on her face as she stood beside the king, all of these were carefully observed by the people and sometimes even interpreted as signs. If the woman smiled during the ceremony, it was considered a sign that the goddess's favor would be abundant. If her face showed seriousness, the people might believe it was an indication that the coming year would be difficult. These interpretations were discussed for days, even weeks, after the ceremony. For the people, being in the same area as this woman, simply seeing her presence was a sacred experience in itself. Most people would witness such a ceremony only a few times in their lives. Therefore, who played the role of the goddess in the ceremony became one of the most important details remembered from that year. The impact of this role was not limited to the ceremony. In the post-ceremony period, the woman who assumed the role of the goddess would hold an important position in social life throughout the year. If she was high priestess, she would participate in other important temple ceremonies, sing hymns, and converse with the people about religious matters. If she was the queen, her influence within the palace would increase, and she might have more say in the king's political decisions. This situation demonstrated how powerful a symbol the female figure could be in Mesopotamian society. The woman representing the goddess was not merely a ceremonial official in the eyes of the people, but also a living symbol of fertility, order, and divine protection. However, the weight of this role was also immense. The slightest mistake made during the ceremony, a hymn read incorrectly, an incomplete offering, a disruption in the ceremonial steps, could lead to both the woman and the ceremony being deemed inauspicious. In such cases, whispers would circulate among the people that the goddess was displeased, and additional ceremonies might be required for the coming year's fertility. Therefore, assuming the role of the goddess was not only a great honor but also a heavy responsibility. The chosen woman would act with the awareness that she represented both her personal reputation and the fate of the city. And each year, as the ceremony approached, the same excited question echoed through the city: who will embody the goddess this year? This question reflected not only the religious curiosity of the Mesopotamian people, but also their political expectations. For this choice was not just a ritual detail, it was important enough to affect the entire year's religious atmosphere, public morale, and even the power balances of the kingship. The choice of the woman representing the goddess in the sacred marriage ceremony was not merely a ceremonial decision in Mesopotamian city-states. It was the most visible test of the power balances between the temple and the palace. This division of duty between the high priestess and the queen led to discussions and sometimes conflicts in both religious and political spheres over centuries. The high priestess, as the earthly representative of the goddess Inanna or Ishtar, possessed direct spiritual authority for this role. She was a woman who had received religious education from childhood, knew every detail of the rituals, and could recite sacred texts by heart. As the leader of the temple community, she was at the center of religious life, not only during the ceremony but throughout the year. Her representation of the goddess was seen by the people as a choice directly based on the will of the gods. The queen, on the other hand, was at the center of political power. As the highest-ranking woman in the palace, she was the king's consort and the representative of the dynasty. If this role was given to her, the political dimension of the ceremony would be strengthened, and the king's divine legitimacy would be reinforced. The queen, embodying the goddess, would make the bond between the palace and the goddess direct and personal. Thus, the king's power would be based not only on administrative authority, but also on a sacred bond. The difference between these two figures was hidden not only in their job descriptions, but also in the worlds they represented. The high priestess carried the silent but continuously present authority of the temple. She was influential over the beliefs of the people, even outside the day of the ceremony. The queen, on the other hand, was intertwined with political power. Her influence was felt more in the palace, in diplomatic relations, and in state administration. Who would be given the role often depended on the political atmosphere of the time. If there was a strong alliance between the king and the chief priest, the high priestess was likely to be chosen. This was ideal for showing the people that the temple and the palace worked in harmony. However, in periods when the king wanted to increase his control over the temple, the queen's selection was preferred. Thus, all control of the ceremony would pass to the palace. This choice would create deep repercussions in the city. Some segments of the population, especially those close to the temple community, found the selection of the high priestess more sacred. In their view, representing the goddess was only fitting for a woman with religious training and a sacred duty. The queen's assumption of this role could be seen as an example of religious purity being used for political gain. On the other hand, there were also those who supported the queen taking on this role. This group generally consisted of those living around the palace, artisans close to the royal family, merchants, and soldiers. According to them, when the queen represented the goddess, the ceremony was more magnificent, and the royal treasury allocated more resources to this event. Furthermore, seeing the king and queen together in this manner conveyed a message to the public that the administration was harmonious and strong. This power struggle between the temple and the palace could even affect the way the ceremony was prepared. In years when the high priestess was chosen, the religious aspect of the ceremony would be more emphasized. Hymn recitations, sacred texts, and traditional offerings played a central role in the ceremony. In years when the queen was chosen, however, visual appeal and splendor took precedence. More ornate garments, larger processions, greater public participation. These differences also altered how the public perceived the ceremony. The political consequences of this choice would become evident in the long run. The queen's assumption of the goddess role would increase the king's influence over the temple and could intensify pressure on the priests. However, this could also create strained relations between the priestly class and the king. In some periods, these tensions escalated into open conflicts, with disagreements arising over the sharing of temple revenues or control over religious ceremonies. In periods when the high priestess was chosen, temple authority would strengthen and more traditional lines would be preserved in religious life. This situation, while not directly weakening the king's political power, would make him more dependent on the temple's approval. This dependency could narrow the king's maneuvering space, especially in times of political crisis. The reactions of the public were based not only on religious beliefs but also on personal loyalties. Some families had been connected with the temple for generations. In their eyes, the election of the high priestess was a part of family honor. Others, as artisans or soldier families serving the palace, saw the queen assuming this role as a development reflecting the power of their own classes. The connection the chosen person established with the public directly influenced the spirit of the ceremony. The high priestess generally displayed a more serious, more sacred demeanor during the ceremony. A smile was rarely seen on her face, and her movements were measured and traditional. The queen, on the other hand, presented herself as a more personable figure, making eye contact with the public, sometimes smiling and occasionally nodding slightly to the crowd. This difference was clearly felt in the comments made after the ceremony. Sometimes this choice could determine not only the religious atmosphere of that year, but also long-term political orientations. If a king consistently chose the queen to play the role of the goddess for several consecutive years, this could herald a period where temple authority weakened and the palace completely seized religious power. Conversely, the consecutive selection of the high priestess would indicate the strengthening of a temple-centric administrative approach. The sensitivity of this power balance was felt at every stage of the ceremony. When the high priestess was chosen, the king's behavior in the ceremony would be more respectful and balanced. When the queen was chosen, the emphasis was on harmony and equality between her and the king. The public would infer great meanings from these small details, trying to predict the political and religious atmosphere of the coming year. And so the question of who would assume the role of the goddess became not just a part of ceremonial preparation, but one of the most important indicators of power balances in the city. Each choice carried both a religious and a political message, a message that continued to live on in the public's memory for years. When the day of the ceremony arrived, the presence of the woman representing the goddess captivated everyone in the square. Who had been chosen had been discussed for months, preparations had lasted for days, and images of how she would appear in the ceremony had formed in the public's mind. But that morning, when the actual figure emerged before the people, all expectations gave way to a profound silence. When she emerged from the palace or temple gates, she carried not only ceremonial attire and symbols. In the eyes of the people, she was the earthly image of the goddess. The tempo of her steps, whether her head was slightly bowed or held high, whether her eyes looked straight ahead or down, all were interpreted as subtle signs that would determine the year's religious atmosphere. If the high priestess had assumed this role, her walk would be slow and measured. During her hymn recitations, her voice would be clear, her tempo slow, and her words full of meaning. Her presence would create a ceremonial solemnity, instilling a sense of respect and peace in the people. If the queen represented the goddess, her walk would be more magnificent, more open to connecting with the public. The queen would sometimes smile, sometimes nod slightly to the crowd in greeting. This made the ceremonial atmosphere a little more human, a little warmer. As they approached the altar, the movements of the woman representing the goddess were the most critical point of the ceremonial choreography. First, she would slowly open the oil jar she held, and with her fingertips drip a few drops of oil onto the altar. This act symbolized the goddess's fertility, mingling with the earth and the people. Then a brief exchange of glances with the king would occur. This glance symbolized the union of divine and earthly powers. The people watched this moment with great attention. The silence in the square was so intense that even the scent of incense carried by the wind was noticed, and distant drum rhythms felt like heartbeats. Some elderly women placed their hands in a prayer position, while young people held their breath. For everyone believed that this moment was the key to the year's fertility and peace. When the hymn section began, the woman representing the goddess would recite the sacred texts either alone or accompanied by priests. The words were spoken not in the language the people understood, but in the ancient ritual language. Even if they did not know the meaning, the rhythm and repetitions of the words led people into a deep state of peace. In this part, sometimes the public would also accompany the rhythm of the hymn by lightly tapping their hands or feet. When the ceremony concluded, the woman representing the goddess would leave the ceremonial area, but her influence would last for days, even months. The people would discuss her demeanor during the ceremony, her tone of voice, her facial expression, and from these they would draw conclusions about how the year would unfold. Comments like, "This year the goddess treated us very gently," or "The priestess stood very seriously. It means we will be tested," would spread. In the post-ceremony period, this woman continued to hold a special position in society. If she was the high priestess, she would be more visible in the temple, taking a prominent role in ceremonies related to fertility, birth, and marriage. People would come to the temple to seek her advice, ask for prayers, and find peace just by seeing her. If she was the queen, her political influence in the palace would increase. She would undertake more representative duties alongside the king and participate in diplomatic receptions and banquets. This role was a symbol that shaped the spirit of not just one day, but an entire year. In the eyes of the people, the woman representing the goddess was not merely a figure in the ceremony, but the guardian of fertility and order. Her presence reminded them that the goddess's eye was still upon the city, and so this entire annual cycle, preparation, selection, ceremony, observation of fertility, and harvest, was always rewoven around this figure. Whether high priestess or queen, it didn't matter. That year, the face of the goddess would be the face of the chosen woman. This sacred marriage tradition was not merely a ritual to invoke fertility, it was also a stage that carried a society's memory, identity, and hope for the future. The political balances of the city-state, its religious hierarchy, the people's expectations and beliefs all converged in this ceremony, beating with the same rhythm for a day. Even centuries later, stories of this ceremony continued to live among the people. Tablets, wall reliefs, and seals found in archaeological excavations confirmed the immense power, both religious and political, of this moment. But perhaps the most enduring record remained in the memory of the people. Because the true power of the ceremony lay not in the invocation of the goddess's name or in the drops of oil sprinkled on the altar. Its real power lay in the people's faith, their hopes, and that shared rhythm they lived together. And thus, this sacred scene, repeated every year, continued to turn for generations like a circle preserving both the spirit and order of Mesopotamia. Sometimes in the silent steps of the high priestess, sometimes in the magnificent procession of the queen, but always in the eyes of the people as the goddess herself. This story concludes here. But for the people living in Mesopotamia, this story would begin anew at the start of every new year. For though the goddess's face might change, her gaze upon the city never would.